Okay, so Drew, so you said one of your athletes has a follow-up question from our Bike Fit episode a few weeks ago. Let's hear it.
Yep. Yeah, a longtime athlete of mine and follower of the podcast. She's actually written in a few questions. So she didn't necessarily write this one in. She kind of just texted it to me, and I was like, Adam and the other people on the podcast might have a better answer than me, so I'll just talk about it on the podcast. And she said she feels pretty good about her bike fit on her gravel bike. And it's been a couple years since she's had a fit, so I think she's maybe considering getting a new fit, but her specific question is, are there any tips for adjusting your bike fit for your mountain bike specifically? So are there any rules of thumb when taking a bike fit from your gravel bike or your road bike and then moving that over to your mountain bike? Since your mountain bike is usually a little bit of a different geometry, and you might have I'm assuming you have a different position on your mountain bike. So just any tips that you guys would have for that.
Do you know what kind of mountain bike, like what category of mountain bike she's got? Like, is it a cross country bike or we're talking a trail bike?
She has both. She has a hardtail and a full suspension.
But is she racing cross country on these, or is the full suspension? Okay, all right.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure, because I mean, if
like
a trail bike could have a very different geometry and bike fit than XC bike.
Oh yeah. Like one of her big races this year is, or every year, is the Mohican Trail 100.
Okay.
And then this year, she's doing another big one in June, but I'm blanking on the name of it. But yeah, like big kind of those 100K mountain bike. Oh, lumberjack. Yeah.
Lumberjack.
She's doing that one too. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I mean, one of the important things to carry over is saddle height. I don't think fore aft needs to be exactly the same on a gravel bike and a mountain bike. Depends on the mountain bike. Some mountain bikes, depending on the front center geometry, how long the bike is, may warrant a little bit more forward seat position versus a XC bike from 5 years ago might be a little bit more neutral, like you'd have on a gravel bike. So it kind of depends on the specific bike, but I think saddle height, so we're talking from the pedal spindle to the kind of contact point on the saddle, should be the same. I know, sometimes people will say, they drop their mountain bike saddle a few millimeters, but I've never really followed that. I think having that saddle position, at least as far as height goes and reach to the pedals, be consistent across your bikes. That to me has always seemed to work best. You've got Q factor to play a role in there, so I mean, that is a little bit of a factor. But if anything, that should reduce your reach a little bit. But one thing that's important, if
Few factors how far apart your feet are from each other, right?
Yeah. And
it's usually wider on a mountain bike.
It's usually wider on a mountain bike, so that depends on like how wide someone's hips are too. If someone's has very narrow hips, it might actually be a little bit longer reach to a wider Q factor. But if someone has a little bit wider, stance, then it could be a little bit more neutral for them. Sometimes you'll see people have less knee pain on a mountain bike because of that Q factor. So it's a little bit more natural movement for them vertically. But barring Q factor, I mean, that's a little bit different. You're dealing with a constraint that you can't really work around, because mountain bikes don't have I mean, as far as I know, I don't think any mountain bikes have a standard road Q factor. But one thing that's important though is if she's running road pedals on her gravel bike and or road bike, the stack height of where your cleat contacts the pedal could be different. So depends on the pedal platform. So
I don't think she is. I'm pretty sure she runs the same pedals across the board.
Yeah, so and that's what I usually recommend to most people. Is if you're gonna ride a gravel bike, put mountain bike pedals on your gravel bike, and then you can have the same shoes, the same pedals on both bikes, and then you can have the exact same as far as saddle height goes. So that's the first thing. You have to like get your saddle in the right position, because if your saddle's not in the right position, then everything else kind of stems from that. So then from there, it's really you're kind of just trying to get a pretty comfortable position on a mountain bike. You're not trying to get too aggressive. You're not necessarily looking for most people, they're not looking for like a highly aerodynamic or aggressive position on a mountain bike. Um, and it's too hard, I think, to give like specifics as far as like what her reach needs to be and what her bar width needs to be without looking at it. Um, as far as like bar width goes, I think we're kind of seeing XC bars come back narrower a little bit again. There was like a pretty distinct trend of like wider, 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 and I think we kind of saw the limits of that at like 750 millimeters, and we're kind of seeing that as like it's stagnated there, and if anything, a lot of people are coming back in, and especially for females too. I think the wider bars can almost create somewhat of an unstable platform at times, because it's like the bars can be a little bit too wide to handle. And Caitlin, you might be able to attest to that. I don't know if you've played around with wider versus narrower bars in your XC bike. You're muted.
Uh-oh.
There you go.
Sorry. Yeah, I actually just went wider. I want to say I have
Okay.
710 on there now from 690, and that
Okay,
feels better.
So you're going
but
wider for you, but it's still like narrower compared to where things have been trending.
But on my bigger trail bike, which I actually just sold because I never rode it, the pivot switchblade, I had pretty wide bars on there, and it was just different. Yeah, I understand that what you're trying to say though. Like you can actually go. Most people say like wider is more stable, but once you cross a certain threshold, it feels like hard to maneuver and it feels more unstable. So.
Yeah, because like mountain biking is all about body bike separation. So like you're wanting to create this separation between what your body's doing and what your bike's doing, so that way your bike can follow the contours of the trail and the terrain, and different variables of what the contact points with your tires and things like that. So if your bars get too wide, if your reach gets too far, then you kind of lose how much mobility you have with extension and contraction of your arms. And that's like really what you need in order to create that body bike separation. So that's why a lot of times a mountain bike position, even though it might look like it's not super aggressive, like even if you look at guys that are racing like World Cup XCO style races, they don't seem to have a very aggressive position a lot of times. They're sitting kind of upright, and maybe their arms are a little bit closer to their body than you would expect for someone that's like trying to optimize for speed. But the reason for that is because they have to keep in mind that body bike separation and in how much leverage they can apply to manipulating that bike. So if you get too far outstretched, too low, you just lose some of that mobility. So I think it's important to just on a mountain bike, like it should feel very comfortable when you're riding just on flats and not even on terrain yet. It should feel not like, I'm not talking like towny cruiser style, but it should feel as if like everything is like comes very naturally, like you fall into place. A few tips like that I think are important to keep in mind too, is something like your brake position. So where are your brakes at relative to where your hands are resting on the bar comfortably? Inboard, outboard, the angle of your brakes. That setup can really reduce a lot of fatigue late into races, especially something like a lumberjack or Mohican 100, where you're talking long endurance events. If you're like straining in order to reach your brakes because they're not in the right position or they're not angled appropriately, that's just going to be unnecessary fatigue on your arms and fingers, and you might get forearm cramps and hand cramps and things like that. And a lot of people don't realize too that you can adjust the reach, like the start position of where your lever is. So a lot of times brakes will come stock pretty far out, so almost as far reach as you can get, and then the expectation is that you can adjust it from there. But if you don't know that adjustment is possible, a lot of times people end up with their brakes too far extended, so it makes it harder and more straining to reach your brakes, which is very important on a mountain bike. So I always say for people, you shouldn't have to straighten your finger to reach your brake. You should be able to keep a pretty neutral, like if you just put your hand out there in space. I know people are listening to this, but for you guys that are watching, like if your hand is just in space and you're not trying to, put any strain on it, it actually just wants to be somewhat flexed. So you actually have to put it under tension in order to straighten it. So if your finger's under tension, in order for you to contact your brake, that's going to bring extra stress and fatigue to your hand and forearm muscles. So that's a little tip that a lot of people that they overlook when they're talking about bike setup and bike fit on a mountain bike, is your cockpit position is really important.
You guys see Dylan's gravel bike with that 150 stem? Why don't people put a 150 stem on their mountain bike?
Mountain bikes just aren't the stock geometry of the frame.
It's just
at
longer.
least nowadays doesn't warrant it. It's not even feasible, really.
Okay.
So when you're looking at frame sizing, stack and reach are kind of the two metrics that you use to compare the size of a frame versus, like in road bikes and gravel bikes, a lot of times you have like 50 millimeter or 50 centimeter frame up to like 61 centimeter frame, and it's like every 2 centimeter increment from there. Sometimes they'll do small, medium, large, that kind of thing, but most of the time on mountain bikes these days, it's small, medium, large, extra large. But if you're just looking at a medium frame across two different brands, that doesn't mean it's going to be the exact same geometry. So two metrics that they have kind of standardized across the industry is stack and reach. And that's just how far horizontally from your bottom bracket the top tube, or basically the top of where your steer tube connects, how far horizontally that is, and then stack is how far vertically. So reach is kind of like how in space, theoretically, if there's no stem on there, how far away where your stem contact point is going to be. So you can like start to compare frames side by side by looking at stack and reach numbers. And if you look at the reach number on a mountain bike, it's usually like 40 to 50 millimeters longer than a gravel bike for similar size. So you basically, you have to reduce the stem length quite a bit. And then on road bikes too, you've also got things like, the shape of the handlebars and the width of the handlebars, and you've got the hoods, which also, add another variable. So that's why it's pretty tricky actually to just translate from a gravel bike fit over specifically to exactly to the same fit on a mountain bike, because there's just a lot of different variables at play with how that cockpit is set up. I mean, I could, if someone came to me and said, I've got this size gravel bike, what mountain bike size should I get and what stem length? Like, I've got a calculator that I can use to do that. But you can't just look at those stack and reach numbers and correspond it from there. But yeah, I think the number one thing is just getting your saddle set up first. Once your saddle's in the right position, then you can start tinkering with stem length, bar width.
Yeah.
And then some of the other angles in position of your brakes and things like that.
So saddle should pretty much be same position, same seat height, and same, I'm assuming basically same seat tilt or angle, whatever you call that.
Yeah. I generally prefer a pretty neutral saddle angle anyways. So if that works for you on your gravel bike, then for sure you could do the same on the mountain bike.
After that episode with Siler a couple weeks ago, I was like, man, I think mine's pretty tilted down. So I went and measured it, and it was like 5 degrees down. I was like, I'm gonna put it back at like 1.5 and see how that feels. And I think that's actually better, because now I'm sitting more, like I'm actually supporting my sit bones instead of like sliding on the tip of my saddle.
Yeah.
And I think the reason I had it so tilted was because last summer when I put aero bars on my bike, I think I had just slowly started to tilt it down and down because I was riding in the aero bars for a few months there. And I just left it that way. But yeah, I think after that episode, I was like, I'm going to play around with and I went about it like what you just said. I was like, all right, I'm going to put my saddle tilt at this. And then once I get there, then I'll figure out where I need to adjust it as far as height and fore aft. but I want it to be somewhat neutral. It is still a little bit tilted down. Instead of
we talked like a little bit, 1 to 2 degrees tilted down, or 1 to 3 degrees maybe even is okay, because of the way that the saddle flexes. So like once you're sitting on the saddle, it's going to kind of neutralize. But anything more than that, and you're just going to have that, that sensation of slipping off the front of your saddle, which just means you're not supporting your sit bones and pelvis properly, and that's just going to take away from power distribution at some point.
Cool. Any other tips for adjusting your mountain bike fit?
Go ahead, Kaylin.
Fit is definitely not my area of expertise. So my starting point was to just get a fit done. A lot of people that do bike fit will have a deal on bringing in your second bike. So if you've done your gravel bike, like they might offer you a discount to bring in a second bike. Because I think the fit will be so different. And I had that fit done like 4 years ago, and I still, it was great. But I still play with things. And I think by, like we mentioned, changing the bars, and I rode somebody else's bike with a shorter stem, and I was like, that feels really different. Like we threw a shorter stem on my bike, and I've changed the cleat position, which changed the saddle height. So playing around, make sure you're documenting all of these changes, so that if you change something and it feels funkier, you know where to go back to. So you're not just moving it around kind of based on memory.
Yeah, we did convince her to do shorter cranks. She said she needed to upgrade her cranks anyways, and so I think she just had the standard 172.5s that came on her bike, and I think
probably 175 on a mountain bike.
Oh yeah, you're right. So she said she was gonna go shorter for cranks, and I said, yeah, I think that's absolutely a good idea, especially since she's doing longer events, to prevent some potential knee issues or whatever.
Yeah, so the important thing with that is it's pretty common. A lot of people will measure their seat height from the bottom bracket.
Yeah.
But that doesn't translate if you have different size cranks. So you have to go from the center of the pedal spindle, so where the pedal threads into the crank, and that height should stay consistent.
When the pedal is like at what point?
The bottom.
At the bottom.
I mean, that's what I do. You could in theory put that pedal wherever you want, as long as it's the same across both bikes, but I always do it fully extended at the bottom.
Drew, how tall is she?
Maybe like 5'6" to 5'8".
Okay.
I think standard.
Yeah, I mean,
she's not like super short or super tall. She's like a average height.
Yeah, the general range is fine. I think that 165 should actually be the standard for an average size man. An average size man being 5'10", because the research seems to indicate that you want it to be like roughly 20% of your leg length. And so 20% of an average man's leg length is roughly 165. So if you're taller than that, you could go longer. But right now, mountain bikes are stocked with 175 and road bikes are stocked with 172.5. And sometimes they go shorter than that on smaller sizes, but I don't feel like they go short enough. I feel like 165 should be probably what a medium-sized bike gets stocked with. And if it's a small-sized bike, it should probably go to 160 or maybe even 155. And then what the current standard is, 172.5 or 175, should really only be on like large and extra large bikes.
So you're saying that she's probably in that 160 range?
Yeah, I mean 160 probably. I don't know if she has long legs or not, but 160 is...
Yeah.
It's not going to make a massive difference. I'm just saying, like, in an ideal world, I think the entire bike industry has been stocking bikes with cranks that are too long for forever. And we're starting to see the shift to shorter cranks, but it should be an industry-wide thing where the standard is 165 and you go up and down from there, not the standard is 175 and you go up and down from there.
Yeah, and especially on a mountain bike, one of the big advantages of going to shorter cranks is less frequent pedal strikes. So, you know, you're at the bottom of your stroke, your pedal's going to be that much higher from the ground. So you're going to have less chance of hitting those rocks and things like that you're not expecting. It sucks to go the opposite way, because all of a sudden you're going to start striking your pedal on stuff that you weren't expecting. But it's like a pleasant surprise when all of a sudden you start reducing pedal strikes because you switch to shorter cranks.
Mm-hmm. I had another personal question or comment on the bike fit thing. I've always sat crooked on my saddle to my right side. So I got some shims, and I was gonna try putting some shims up under my right cleat to try and push the right side of my hip up. And I hadn't really worried about this for a long time, but at BWI Arizona, I had really bad back pain real early in the race, and it affected the way that I raced. So I was like, all right, I need to figure this out. And so I kind of did some reading and some watching of videos and stuff. And it seems like maybe if I'm sitting crooked, maybe I'm using too many of those stabilization muscles, and maybe I'm rocking back and forth. I don't know. So I was thinking maybe if I put some shins under my right foot and raise my right side of my hip, I'm hoping that would put me a little more centered on the saddle. Is that good? Like,
So
before I do
are
this,
you
is
on
this gonna
are you
jack
on
me up?
a mountain bike pedal or a road pedal?
Road pedal.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
The reason I say that is I think shims are much less effective on mountain bike platforms. So like traditional SPD pedals and cleats, they don't work very, very good, but they can work fine for road pedals. That is an option. You could definitely try that. My first question was going to be if you had any issues with it, and it sounds like you do. If you have back pain, then that's definitely
that was the
something you
main
want to
reason I looked
address.
into it. I've sat like this since college. Like, even in college, people were like, "Yeah, you sit crooked on your saddle." And I actually, when I got my bike fit with Siler, that was something that I mentioned to him, and he said if it's not causing any issues, he said that's kind of just the way your body has adapted to the bike, and if it's not causing any issues, and no need to force it to change. But I'm kind of wondering if maybe some of that back pain was caused from that.
Yeah, it definitely could be. That was a big part of the back pain that I've dealt with for the last few years was all of a sudden I started sitting crooked like that too, or my right sit bone wasn't even touching the saddle. It was like cantilevered off in space.
Yeah, that's probably what.
The thing is,
probably accurate.
You know, if you've been sitting this way on the bike for a long time, and only now you're starting to have some pains, then there's probably something else biomechanically that has changed. So that could be maybe you've for years have, you know, overcompensated due to some, you know, imbalance on your right side. But now all of a sudden, maybe from strength training or more running or just other mobility stuff, you've come to some more equilibrium off the bike. Then, you know, now that could be translating to some issues on the bike when you're sitting asymmetrically like that. I would just be cautious in the amount of changes, like the extent of the change that you make, you know, so like you can get different size shims.
Yeah.
And I'd probably start with something like 0.5 millimeter or maybe 1 millimeter at most to begin with. And don't change anything else. Don't change, you know, your saddle height or position or bar position, anything. Like, try and isolate the variables and try it, and don't go out for like a 7-hour ride. Try it on like a few shorter rides and just see how it feels. Because if you've pedaled that way for years, that's going to be a habit that's going to need to be broken.
Right.
Assuming it's actually needs to be broken, you know, if there is something that's an issue. So the thing is, though, shims usually are introduced when someone has a leg length discrepancy. So when you do a variety of different tests, you know, whether it's with your bike fitter or a physical therapist, they can assess your kind of like proportionate leg length from one side to the other. So usually if there's a noticeable and measurable difference from one side to the other, that's when you want to introduce shims. So that could be something that you have going on. And again, like maybe you've just gotten used to it over the years. But just be cautious that there may be other things that get introduced as far as aches or pains or possibility for injury by changing this position that you become so accustomed to. So that's why you want to do it very incrementally over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Got it. Cool. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't like shooting myself in the foot by doing this. So thanks.
Yeah.
But no, isolating the issue, that's good advice. Like only doing one thing at a time.
That's a pretty good practice for anything when you're trying to address some kind of like bike fit issue, is not changing too many variables at once, because then you just don't really know if you're going in the right direction or not with something.
Right. Makes sense. Cool. Thanks for that. All right. Sorry, I ate up 25 minutes of the conversation.
That's all right. We got a few questions in queue here. So let's do this first question from Taylor. Taylor says, I'm in the Army and I'm on deployment in the Middle East for 7 months through July 2025. Thank you for your service, Taylor. Appreciate that. I managed to get a mountain bike out here, which is already better than I expected, and I'm wondering how I should structure my training. My goals are long gravel rides next year in the late summer/fall. So talking, later 2025. I have a 2.5 mile rolling rocky/gravel loop with about a 0.7 mile stretch of slightly uphill or downhill pavement that I can do most of my riding on, as well as a spin bike that's pretty uncomfortable past an hour. No power meter or anything fancy though. I have plenty of time during the week, so that is not an issue. With absolutely no racing until I get back, I'm wondering how it is best to structure this time. Thanks, Taylor.
Well, I don't necessarily think that he needs to do something special. Because usually when somebody, his situation is special in that it's a situation that a lot of people are not in, but his schedule, usually when people submit a question like this, they're like, well, I can't, I work for 4 days straight and I can't ride, or this or that or whatever. Sounds like he's got plenty of time to train. It's just he's in a, I guess, unique situation location wise, but it sounds like the time he has to train is not an issue. So I wouldn't necessarily do anything out there or weird. I would just do proper training like we've been talking on this podcast. And maybe I'm being a little bit vague here, but like that's a very open-ended question, and we could take that in a lot of different ways, what proper training looks like.
Yeah.
I think the first thing that comes
I'm
to
also
my
not sure
mind
if Taylor's a male or female, so
yeah, I was wondering that too.
Oh, fair enough.
The first thing that comes to my mind is, I don't know what kind of position he has in the military, but I would imagine it's a hard job. Like when I think of the Army, I think of, doing drills and running with packs, and it's hot all the time. If he's in the Middle East, like I'm imagining he's got quite a bit of stress from work. And so I think one thing that I would keep in mind is, you could definitely go super broad on this, but I would think one of the things that where my mind went was don't discount the stress that you get from work and then just think, oh, I can do a full training program on my bike. Like you've got to be able to balance both. Like you be aware that if you have a strenuous job, you need to take that into consideration when you're also doing your training on the bike as well. Sure. It's like if you're going, I don't know, if you've got like a drill day and you've got to, do all these running and carrying weights and obstacle courses. I don't know. I've never been in the military, but but that just seems like what they do.
A lot of the, I think a lot of that comes more in basic training.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's definitely some level of maintenance training that goes on, but Taylor says that they've got plenty of time during the week. So I'm not saying that there's not stressful things. So I definitely agree with keeping that in mind. But, assuming if there's ample time to train, then that means there's probably not, too much stress going on other than like being in the Army in the Middle East. Like that alone can be stressful.
Yeah. Sounds stressful to me.
I feel like when they asked how to structure their training, it was less about the time aspect and more about how to do it because of the tools they have available to them. And like a 2.5 mile loop. I don't know if that's including the 3/4 mile stretch of pavement or not, but
Yes, it does.
okay. So that's short. That's a challenge in itself. And then it sounds like the bike might be a traditional, like, super upright, fat seat, dial type spin bike. So not something comparable to a trainer where you can be on that comfortably for like 2.5 hours doing a workout. But if there's a gym available, you can introduce strength training, maybe a treadmill. I mean, doing a 2.5 mile running loop feels a lot different than riding. So I think this would be an interesting challenge. And just as a thank you for serving our country and listening to the podcast, I would say, like, shoot me an email and I'll write you a plan for the next 7 months of your deployment. Just because I think it would be really fun to, like, get creative with the tools that you do have available to you. Because there would be a lot to talk about as far as, like, your actual time commitment, how much availability you have, and what specific events you're targeting. They say longer gravel rides.
Right. That's the part that I think gets kind of tricky with this, because if you're trying to build up, your endurance and aerobic capacity to be able to withstand longer gravel rides and races later this year, what you have at your disposal could be a limiting factor. You can only do so many 2.5 mile laps of the same exact route, even if you're doing it backwards, before it gets a little stale. And that's a real thing. I mean, all of us like to think that we can be super hard and, it doesn't matter what kind of terrain we've got. We can just, put our head down and do the work. But, I mean, I've been there where it's like, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to mix it up, try something else. And I do think that's where something like throwing in a, 2.5 or 5 mile or 7.5 mile or whatever it is, like, run in there, like, I think, running could be definitely a good way to mix things up with the terrain and stuff you're given. But yeah, that's a super cool offer, Caitlin. So Taylor out there, if you're listening, try and get in touch with Caitlin and she'll maybe give you a little bit more specific feedback or layout of what that should look like.
We can make that
I think it really just depends on how much of a psycho you want to be. People have done some crazy things. Like,
did you guys hear about the
woman
Chipotle challenge?
No, dude, no. The woman
There's
who
a Chipotle challenge on this. Caitlin knows what I'm talking about. If you the whoever is the local legend, is it already over? I don't know. I think it was up until the end of March, or it's for 2 or 3 months. I don't know. And whoever is the local legend on this one hill in, I don't know, New York City or something like this, whoever does it the most amount of times gets Chipotle for a year. And there are dudes that are, like, around the clock doing this run, just up and down this hill over and over and over again. And they're, like, I'm assuming to where Dylan was going, is, like, they're highly motivated and they will just go up and down this hill for free Chipotle for a year. So it depends on, like, how motivated are you to do this crazy psychotic thing.
Drew, the example that I was going to give, I don't know if it's crazier than that. I think it is crazier because you said it's a 3-month period.
I don't remember what the exact,
whatever,
but it was like over a month, I think.
This example, I think, is even crazier than your example. The woman who holds the record for the most number of miles ridden in a year, she did it on a TT bike, basically on this. I don't think she did all the miles on this loop, but almost all the miles that she did in the year were done on one loop on a TT bike that's flat.
Like a 1 mile loop?
She chose a loop that she could go very fast on because she's trying to cover the most number of miles. And I forget how long the loop was, but it wasn't long. It was like 3 miles, 4 miles. And she did that
just every day
for 15 hours a day, every day for a year.
Oh,
wow.
Oh. What's the distance? Do you know?
86,000 miles.
That's over 1,000 miles a week. That's like 1,500 miles a week.
Yeah.
Which is what? 200 miles a day?
I don't know the math on it, but it's crazy.
What's wrong with her?
So she did most of that riding on one loop. That's like very short. Honestly, probably pretty comparable to this guy's loop. So I guess what I'm getting at here with bringing up that example is, I don't know. It just people have done crazy things with a small amount of terrain at their disposal. And
I've heard of a guy who, there's this thing called run streaking where, you have to run at least a mile every day and you can go for as long as possible. And I think I had heard this or read about this guy who wanted to keep his streak going, and he had a blizzard come in, and he went on in, and I don't think you can do it on a treadmill. I don't think. And, or maybe he didn't have a treadmill. I don't know. But for some reason, this dude shoveled his driveway, like shoveled a path to get the snow out of the way, and then just ran back and forth in his driveway until he hit a mile, just so he could keep his run streak alive. That sounds pretty crazy. Wow. Talk about limited space. You just have to go back and forth in your driveway.
So if you only have one set loop to work with, I feel like to keep it interesting, the novelty has to come from the workout itself. Because I think back to high school and college track, like being on the track 3 days a week, I never got tired of it because it feels totally different when you're doing 200-meter repeats as compared to when you're doing 1,600-meter repeats. And then you go for a cool down. Example. And you do a cool down on the track, super chill with your friends or whatever. And it just like, it all feels totally different. You don't realize that you're running, if you're indoor, a 200-meter track or outdoor, a 400-meter track. You don't pay attention to the laps, but like it feels different and interesting and engaging based on the workout. So I think we could do something pretty fun there.
Yeah. I mean, I 100% agree. I think structure totally changes like your perception of your terrain and environment, so if you can make that 2.5 mile loop structured in some way, and it doesn't even have to be intensity, like you can structure endurance rides. You can have, I'm going to do this 2.5 mile lap at 130 beats per minute, and I'm going to do it at 140 beats per minute, and kind of like mix it up that way. If you have something that's more of like an acute goal that you're working towards within that structure, I totally think that breaks up the monotony. So again, reach out to Caitlin. She put up her hand to help you out. So I think that's awesome. Let's just hit one more here. So this is from Scott. And Scott says, love the podcast. So much great content and love the show. Also, let's get DJ to start making food training plans for those marginal gain nerds that want to follow a training plan on what to eat. That was just a suggestion. My question has to do with my legs giving out before my lungs and the best way to adjust training to fix that. Basically, anytime I go over zone 2, my failure point is always my legs giving out before heart rate or breathing are an issue. I struggle to get my breathing rate elevated in VO2 max sessions unless it's a 30-30 style session. Traditional 120% FTP for 45 minutes increases breathing, but never to a point where I feel getting oxygen is hard or uncomfortable. For me, it's just finding the will to push through the legs giving out. I assume this comes down to lactate clearance as an issue, or maybe I'm just being a little baby and need to toughen up. Any advice on good ways to train to help improve this issue?
I actually think that's a pretty standard feeling across most cyclists, unless we're talking about an unacclimated rider riding at altitude. I think feeling like legs are giving out before you're gasping for air, I would say that's how you should be feeling. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I do find it a little concerning that Scott can't get his breathing rate up enough during a VO2 max session. I mean, when I'm done with a VO2 max session, I'm breathing very heavily. And that's the whole point of a VO2 max session, is to reach a state of VO2 max where you're sucking in as much oxygen as possible by the end of that session. So that part concerns me a little bit and says like maybe his legs are the limiting factor there and not allowing him to get to that point of actual VO2 max state. I think, but I agree. I mean, and that's why a lot of times people from altitude suffer when they come down from altitude and they're at sea level, because now all of a sudden they have this new stimulus of my legs are burning, but I can breathe all of a sudden, and they're not used to that muscular fatigue as much as they are the respiratory fatigue. So you don't see as much of that like benefit translating over from that, coming down to sea level as you do when they're racing at altitude. But yeah, I agree. Most people, that's probably the case, has more to do with legs giving out than breathing.
I was kind of surprised because he said it's anytime I go over zone 2. And I feel like that would be addressed in normal periodization, where if you're extending time and tempo, your legs are getting stronger, pushing that power. You know what I mean?
I gotta say again, going over zone 2 is when your legs start to hurt. That's just standard. That's just how you feel when you ride a bike. I don't like personally when I hear what this guy's quote problem is, and I don't want to minimize it. I'm just like, man, that's just how it feels when you ride a bike, man.
I had never really, I'd heard people kind of use this language before and never really understood it. I felt like anytime I did a hard workout or a VO2 workout, my legs and my breathing were always like tapped out at the end of it. Like I couldn't have gone harder or easier either way. Like my legs were hurting and I was breathing totally a ton. And this year I did reverse periodization. So I was doing high intensity earlier in the training. So like, I guess technically when I was less fit, and when I was less fit, I understood what this guy was saying. Like I felt like I was limited by my legs. Like I couldn't, it got to the point where I was trying to do these really hard, short intervals, like 1 minute, 2 minute intervals. And my breathing was under control, but my legs just couldn't put out the power. So I wonder if it's just an overall, like, because I was doing those intervals real early and I was less fit, maybe it's an overall fitness thing.
Let me ask you a question, Drew. If you are used to putting out a certain power number, and you couldn't put out that power number because you weren't fit enough. Let's hypothetically say that you are fit now. If you try to put out 10% more power, what's going to give out first? Your breathing too heavy or your legs hurt?
I don't know. I'd have to go do the workout.
Okay, so what do you?
I honestly don't know. I don't know how to answer your question.
What do you think would happen? I know, dude, you ride a bike 20 plus hours a week. I know you know the answer to this.
Probably my legs.
Yeah.
Because my aerobic capacity can handle it. It's my legs that can't handle it.
Exactly, dude. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So just
like
that's
when
just
you
what
spent
riding
this
a bike
much
feels
time,
like.
when you've just spent this much time like building aerobic capacity, like for years and years and years, it becomes less of an issue, and the legs are more the issue. Is that accurate?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is just what it feels like to ride a bike.
Yeah, and I think kind of what Dylan's getting at too is I'd be curious, Drew, like when you were feeling that sensation of your legs giving out before anything else, were you trying to hit power numbers that you wanted to hit or that were realistic for you to hit at the time? Were you trying to hit power numbers?
No, I think they were realistic. I wasn't shooting for anything crazy. Like,
okay.
Yeah, I knew that. So, I was
there
less
could just
fit,
be some level of detraining that plays a factor there. I will say, I definitely notice when I'm less fit, my legs hurt more.
Yeah, for sure.
But then as I get more fit, I'm able to, that's just part of training. You're able to, you're able to withstand whether it's more lactate buildup in the fatigue, or there's just less lactate buildup because you're more fit and you're able to extend, that point of exhaustion. I know Dylan's probably his eyes are gonna glaze over when I say this, but I have found that some of these workouts where it does feel like my legs are the limiting factor, when I've used something like the PR lotion or sodium bicarbonate cream, that it does extend my ability to hold that time and zone for a little bit longer.
The other thing I would mention, and this is probably even more application than the lotion is just make your recovery periods longer. Like if it's a lactate
Sure.
issue, then if you're only giving yourself 3 minutes of recovery between these intervals, like just double that up. Just do like 5 or 6 minutes of recovery. Like, yeah, some of the adaptations won't be quite the same, but like if you end up doing at the end of the workout, if you end up doing more time in zone because you extended those recovery periods, I think that that's worth it because you'll be able to end up doing more work that way.
Yeah, so I mean, we could talk about specific workouts too. So there are lactate clearance workouts that you can do and put in your training routine to help with this. So, like Drew, you're talking about recovery periods in between intervals, but you can also do things like hard start threshold intervals where you do like 1 or 2 minutes of VO2 max, power at VO2 max, so 120%, and then you drop it down to like sub threshold or right at threshold, and you kind of train your body's ability to quote unquote recover or buffer lactate at a hard steady state.
Yeah.
So like that could be something, and you have to work up to that. You have to do, maybe you do 1 minute at VO2 max and then 4 minutes at threshold, and then you extend that time at VO2 max, and then you extend that time at threshold, and you're kind of like improving your body's ability to clear lactate or buffer lactate or whatever you want to terminology you want to use, but basically your body's ability to kind of go back to some state of steady state at with lactate already kind of started to accumulate.
Typical over-unders workouts. Yeah,
over-unders. I mean, that's what over-unders
you're just
are
playing
trying to do,
with the going up and like over and above or under and over the FTP to do what you're saying.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's not as bad as he thinks, and I wonder if doing an experiment where you do a normal 20-minute FTP test and then do a ramp test, and I feel like if your legs are truly the limiting factor, your ramp test result would be much lower than the number you would get for your 20-minute test, if that makes sense.
Personally, I would be more concerned if this person's question was the exact opposite. They're talking about doing efforts, intervals, and they're like, my legs feel fine, but I am completely out of breath. I'd be like, that's a red flag right there. It should be the opposite. Like when you're saying, I'm not out of breath, but my legs hurt. I'm like, dude, that's, and I hate, I've said this 10 times already. I've said this 10 times already, but that's what it feels like to ride a bike. That's what it feels like to ride a bike. Your legs hurt. So I'm personally like.
You think this guy has a high VO2?
I don't know.
Well, that's his next question.
If you can knock out the power and not be out of breath, that's to me says you got.
That's the.
Oh, it's the same guy who asked the next question.
It's the same. Scott asked another question, which we were going to get to, but I don't know if we have time.
Whether he has a high VO2. I don't think this is an indication that you have a high or low VO2, because part of whether or not you have a high or low VO2 will also affect the lactate buildup in your legs and affect how much your legs hurt. So I don't necessarily think unless your VO2 is like unhealthfully low or you're completely untrained. You know what I mean? Like if you're off the couch untrained, I could see you doing a hard effort and being completely out of breath because your cardiovascular system is not trained at all. But I think that anybody who's like decently trained, their legs are gonna hurt before they get out of breath.
Yeah. All right, we'll save the VO2 one. I do want to make a comment about his last little thing where he says maybe I just need to stop being a little baby and toughen up. That's everybody. I think that on every one of my workouts. Like, I gotta toughen up. Like,
I'm glad he asked that at the end because I feel like that's what I've been trying to say this whole question, but I've been being too nice about it.
Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Yes, but also yes, everyone. Like, I think even no matter what you're right now, if you're trying to get faster, then yeah, you gotta stop being a baby and toughen up. Like, watch some YouTube videos of David Goggins. Bro, that guy is tough. Like, I read about these people who like go through like freaking really hard things. I just finished a book called The Comeback Quotient, and the whole book is about people that have like crap that happens to them and they've got to overcome it, and the mental fitness that goes with that. It's a Fitzgerald book, of course, but I'm reading this and I'm like, oh my gosh, all these people are way tougher than I am. Like he talks about Greg LeMond getting shot and then like almost dying, and then a year later winning the Tour de France.
I didn't even know
all
about
these
that.
crazy stories. You guys don't know about that?
I never heard that story.
Oh,
No.
dude, LeMond got shot by his uncle in a freak hunting accident. His uncle wasn't a very good hunter, and then was in the hospital for like months. And then I think 2 years after that was winning the Tour de France again.
Sick.
Yeah. Anyways, but I read these stories and I'm like, I'm a little baby. Like I am a wimp. Like I complain because my back hurts a little bit and I just need to toughen up. Like, I don't know. I think everybody needs to take that mentality.
Yeah, I mean,
up.
I think that's real. And I think some of the biggest breakthroughs in performance come from the mental side of things, not the physical. It's like reaching that breaking point and like experiencing, pushing past that. And all of a sudden you've unlocked something that you didn't even know was there. And it's like, okay, let's say it was a, power target number or, certain time up a climb, like you see it all across the board. It's like, as soon as you know that potential is actually real and you could actually do that and achieve it, now all of a sudden that goal is like, that's easy. I could do that anytime. And what's next? So I totally agree with that.
If I were to get knuckle tattoos like on my two fists, I would get it to say only pain, because that's been like my motto. Like every hard workout I'm doing, I'm thinking to myself, and I got this from the book as well, is like, it's only pain. Like, suck it up. This is only pain. And I even take it a step further. And when I'm like on the verge of quitting an interval because it sucks so bad, I'm like, I'll remind myself that I only feel this way on rare occasions. Like, I only get to this point where I want to quit an interval because it hurts so bad. I don't do that often. And so when I'm in that moment, I'm like, this is good for me. And I'm going to stay here for a little longer, because in a race, I'm going to be in this moment almost guaranteed. At some point in the race, I'm going to be at this moment where I want to quit and I don't want, and I'm like, part of me wants to quit and part of me doesn't want to quit. And so when I'm feeling that in an interval, I'm like, just suck it up and do it until the end of the interval or a little longer or whatever. Right, and I think to myself, it's only pain.
Let me give some pushback, because I feel like we've got a little too far into deep end. I used to be with Drew. You should end your interval session on the ground. Yeah,
this isn't every interval session,
but
just
like,
by the way.
I've actually walked that back, and I would say that most of my intervals, I'm trying to leave one in the tank. Meaning I'm ending my interval session feeling like I'm pretty wiped, but I could do one more if somebody had a gun to my head. Not even like that extreme, but like I could do one more if
your coach
really
was there
wanted to.
and he said do another. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's actually how you should end most interval sessions. Not maybe once in a while you can actually give it a 10 out of 10, but I wouldn't give it a 10 out of 10 on every session. On race day, I would.
I think that's good advice.
Give it a 10 out of 10.
But I still think there's like a 1 minute, like when you're doing a 5 minute VO2, the 1 minute's always, the last minute of a 5 minute VO2 always sucks.
Yeah,
like
no, I mean, it's good. Quit. Yeah, it does suck. And it's good to keep in mind. You know what's funny about your knuckle tattoo thing is when I was in college on my training bike, on my handlebars, I had written on my handlebars, all I know is pain.
No pain, but KNOW, no pain. That's even better.
Yeah, I guess.
My mental trick is, like, say whether you have 3 intervals left or 3 minutes, I break it up into sections. And if I'm doing it for me, I'm going to bail. But if I say this one's for, like, my dad because he was always tough on me, I'll get through that. This one's for my husband because he supports me, I'll get through that.
Wow, that's a whole nother level.
This one's for my kid, this one's for my dog, whatever it is for you.
I thought you were just going to say chunking, because chunking is a good strategy as well. But you're doing chunking and like gratitude. Like, that's cool. Wow. I'm going to try that.
It works.
Nice.
Dedication.
I did a VO2 max workout yesterday that I quit actually, which is very rare for me. But
Baby.
I know it's haunted. I'm gonna do it again today because it's haunted me ever since. It was not effective. But what happened was it was supposed to be like a 3-hour workout that got reduced to a 45-minute time window, and the only way that I could fit the VO2 max session inside of that time window was to reduce the recovery time.
Yeah.
So I was trying to do 5 minutes on, 3 minutes off, which just was not effective.
You could probably
And
do
the
it like
worst,
3 times, but after that,
I did it. That's why I did it 3 times. I couldn't get the 4th one. But the problem is the worst part is I picked the wrong workout. So it was actually the trainer was controlling it on the timer was on 4-minute intervals. So it was a 4x4, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. So I just converted that because I wanted to do 4x5. So I did 5 minutes on, 3 minutes off. And what that meant was I had to extend past the timer. When the timer hit 0, I had to go another minute into the recovery, which was like heartbreaking every single time. It was like a huge mental challenge to like get to 0 and then go, okay, I've still got 1 more minute that I've got to hold this for. And yeah, unfortunately I cracked it halfway through the 3rd one, but
you can maybe do that with like less hard intervals, like under FTP intervals, but over FTP, shortening the recovery almost like
it doesn't
works.
It's not good. Yeah. Don't recommend it. But it was a really good example. I've never done that before, where like I've actually extended beyond what the timer says. I don't know why. I've never even thought about it really. But it kind of goes back to like what Dylan's talking about too, with like leaving 1 more in the tank. That doesn't mean that you're not going hard for the interval. It just means that there's enough in reserve that if you needed to do another interval. So kind of, going back to Scott's question here, like part of me wonders, you're not reaching a state of VO2 max. That seems concerning. Like, are you actually going hard enough? I know you say your legs are giving out, but maybe you need to go harder for 3 minutes and see, like, can you push yourself into that state of VO2 max? You should be breathing hard by the end of that 5 minutes.
I was going to say that too, yeah.
And it could be a thing too where maybe you need to switch up your cadence. Maybe your preferred cadence has gotten too low over time. And if your preferred cadence is in the like low 80s or upper 70s, you might be recruiting too much too much of like your muscular system instead of your cardiovascular system and respiratory system. So you might want to do something like cadence drills to increase your cadence, like preferred cadence.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm going to go back to my answer and say this is not something that you should be concerned about.
Or it's just not an issue.
Yeah, it's real. Like I don't want to feed into this idea that this is an issue. What I'm trying to tell him is that it's not an issue, and I think that's the right answer, personally.
All right.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But we also gave him some tips too.
Yeah.
And we told him to stop being a baby.
So we'll save Scott's follow-up question for next week.
Oh, I just saw the end of it. The last 3 words are something about higher than Drew's. So, good.
Yeah. All right, cool.
VO2.
All right.
All right. Next week.
Sounds good. See ya.
Yeah.
See ya.